Okay, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. I am Nala Afifa and I want to talk about how inhibitors can affect the reaction. Okay, first of all, we need to know an equation which is where enzyme plus substrate will form an enzyme substrate complex and will produce enzyme and product. Okay, as we can see here, there are an inhibitor and the structure is almost same to the substrate. Okay, now as the substrate want to bind with the active site of the enzyme, the inhibitor might have more affinity to bind with the active site of the enzyme. So, this substrate cannot bind to the enzyme as the inhibitor block it. Okay, now the only way to continue this reaction is by increasing the concentration of the substrate. When the concentration of substrate is increased, then the inhibitor will go down and the substrate can bind to the active site of the enzyme and will form enzyme substrate complex which will produce enzyme and a product. Okay, that reaction is we call competitive inhibition. Okay, now let's take a look at non-competitive inhibition. Okay, as we can see here, the inhibitor will bind with the other side of the enzyme, which we call allosteric site. After the inhibitor binds to the allosteric site, it will form an enzyme inhibitor complex. This enzyme can still bind with the substrate, which is here. And if this enzyme react with substrate, we will produce enzyme substrate inhibitor complex. And if this happen with the inhibitor here, there are no product will be produced. But there are possible way to produce product, which is this inhibitor here need to be released. When the inhibitor is released, then it will form enzyme substrate complex, which is the normal one, and then the enzyme and the product can be produced. And this is what we call as non-competitive inhibition. Okay, now let's take a look at uncompetitive inhibition. The uncompetitive inhibitor will only bind to the enzyme substrate complex, which is this enzyme substrate, which is enzyme substrate complex. Then there is the allosteric site where the inhibitor will bind into the site. And when the inhibitor bind at here, which is the allosteric site, it will form enzyme substrate inhibitor complex. And as we know, if the inhibitor is here, there will be no product will be produced. But if we are able to release the inhibitor, then we will form back enzyme substrate complex, and then we will manage to produce enzyme and the product.